Excuse me, we have to start the next course. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to continue talking about basically like determinants of healthcare costs, and so I sort of mentioned earlier that the some materials a little bit, it repeats a little bit some of the stuff we've already talked about, but the thing I particularly like about this set of slides and the sort of papers and references are that there's sort of a specific model, a specific economic model that the authors propose about, or that basically has the potential to explain why costs or how costs can be so much higher in some regions or in some countries relative to other regions in other countries, and specifically do so in sort of a rational way that's not simply not some sort of caricature of, say, doctors trying to just maximize revenue. So there probably is some doctor sitting around solely trying to maximize their income, but I suspect that most doctors aren't sort of actively thinking like, oh, my objective is to just maximize total physician income, and I don't really care about the welfare of my patients or anything like that. If you really didn't care at all about the welfare of your patients, you probably wouldn't have gone into medicine to begin with. So just like you can watch a movie and they have a caricature of some sort of evil villain who wants to come up with some mastermind plan to take over the world. Nobody actually, there are people who many would classify as being evil, but even they generally don't think of themselves as being evil. And likewise, I don't think most people think of themselves as being motivated solely by profit maximization. But that doesn't really need to be the case in order to come up or find yourself in scenarios where revenues are really sort of driving decisions, or so parts of where revenues are driving decisions, or where sort of thinking about like effectiveness, cost effectiveness, thinking about like how much you're getting for a given dollar spent doesn't really play a role in the decisions that people want to make. So we'll see that in a little bit. So the last time we ended, we just talked about essentially how the U.S. spending as a share of GDP, so spending per capita as a share of GDP, back in 1980 actually wasn't that much higher than other countries. So again, per capita GDP was higher than some of these countries, so total spending per capita would have still been somewhat higher. But since then, in 2008, at the sort of second snapshot here in these figures, spending as a share of GDP per capita on medical healthcare had increased substantially, and so now we're clearly an outlier, and this is just basically the growth rate of the healthcare share of GDP. And again, that we look like an outlier there in terms of having had that grow much faster than most other developed countries over the last few decades. So, you could think like, well, we look at that, we think that doesn't look very good. Costs are increasing, but then you might think, okay, well, we're getting more for these costs. And so Rudy Giuliani certainly seems to think so. So he claimed, and this was probably back in the 2008 elections or thereabout, that his chance of surviving prostate cancer in the United States was 82%. So he actually had prostate cancer. He was treated for it. As far as I know, he was cured since he's still alive. In England, he claims that, so England, of course, has a national healthcare system. In England, he claims that the chance of surviving would have been only 44% under socialized medicine. So he's implying that you have much worse outcomes there. And I would be very skeptical of any facts that politicians throw out. So I don't know that this fact is actually true. But let's make a heroic assumption and assume that he's actually not lying to us, and it is in fact true that the survival rate is 82% in the U.S. and 44% in England. Even if that is in fact the case, that doesn't really tell you anything about. Certainly, it doesn't imply that care in the United States is more effective than in England, like he is suggesting. So, in fact, what it almost certainly implies is essentially that we do a lot more prostate screening in the United States than they do in England. So, prostate cancer is sort of a very controversial cancer to treat, just because if you took like a random sample of men who were say in their 80s or 90s, so these are people who survived a very long time, to a first approximation, almost 100% of them would have some sort of signs of like precursors to prostate cancer. The problem is that you don't know whether or not it will ever become an issue for any particular man. So, once you start screening men in their like 50s, 60s, 70s, most of them will have essentially an enlarged prostate, which eventually could turn into prostate cancer. The thing is that in most cases it grows so slowly that they're going to die of something else first. So you're sort of faced with this decision, given that you screen for it, so they'll screen for like specific markers, and if that comes up positive, then they'll consider doing a biopsy, and then depending on the results of the biopsy, they may or may not decide to treat it. So if you screen for it, in many cases with older men, you will detect it. The problem is it's not clear what to do because, again, in most cases, if you just kind of wait and watch, like nothing really happens, and so they actually have one of the treatment regimens just called watchful waiting, where essentially they just kind of monitor it from year to year and make sure it's not getting too much worse, and then if it is, maybe they'll do something, but if it's not, they basically don't intervene. Alternatively, you could say, well, we're going to err on the side of caution and treat it, and that will, it is effective. They could go in and do surgery and stuff. The problem is that there are very substantial side effects, which are not particularly pleasant, potentially to treating prostate cancer, and so you really don't want to treat it if it's not going to be an issue, but in the majority of cases it won't be an issue. So it's sort of, they used to, I think, recommend sort of universal screening for the antigen after a certain age, but now I think they're not even sure about that recommendation anymore, just because it's not clear, even if it comes up positive, it's not clear what you really want to do about it. So assuming this is true, all this is saying is that essentially we're doing a lot more screening in the U.S., and so what we do is we find lots and lots of prostate cancers that won't ever be a problem, and then we treat them anyway, and then we say, oh yeah, we saved your life because we treated something that wasn't going to be a problem, whereas in England all they're doing is treating prostate cancer that actually has developed into a true cancer that needs to be treated. Obviously, if you treat things that will never be a problem, then you always end up with very high success rates because it's very easy to treat something that isn't an issue. Whereas if you only treat serious cancers, then you end up with low success rates because they're serious, so you might not survive. So this is really only, so again, assuming these facts are true, this only is saying that we do a lot more screening in the U.S. than some of the other countries. So despite all of our robust increases in spending, the actual gains in terms of survival rates for men and for women of certain ages aren't particularly impressive. So this is comparing the mean gain in 12 comparison countries that are developed countries, so mean gain in life expectancy after a given age, or survival rates, I guess, for men versus or men and women separately in the U.S. versus these other countries. And basically, what you would like to see is that the gains in the survival rates are higher in the U.S. So in the light blue bars, that the gains are higher than in the dark blue bars, which are comparison countries. Given that we're increasing our spending more, but you don't see that in fact in anything. You see the opposite. We're kind of lagging. No, you mean like specifically what it is that drives that versus the other ones being like relatively close to each other? No, that's a good question. So we have to look. Even in an article, I'm not sure that they have a specific explanation for it because it's, basically they're just looking at what the trends are, but they don't necessarily know what the underlying factors are that are causing those trends. The assumption here is just that to the extent that either the extent that something's causing it, it's either not the increased spending. So basically, either the increased spending is completely ineffective or is not effective enough to offset whatever sort of negative trends are in the U.S. relative to other countries. So remember we talked about how Cutler and Richardson had done a calculation of the increase in health capital that had accrued from increased spending in medical technology. So a subsequent paper by Hervé Topel also did similar calculations and estimated that health capital had increased by $95 trillion from 1970 to 2000. I think it's somewhat later, like a little bit later period than the Cutler and Richardson one. But again, coming up with sort of the same figure that look how much quality adjusted life years have basically increased across the last few decades. So yes, we are spending much more, but maybe we're getting a lot more as well. And this is just then showing. So that's sort of at the aggregate country level over time. This is just showing within the country in more detail that figure that I had cited before that said that some regions end up spending like twice as much per capita or more on Medicare per enrollee, really twice as much per enrollee or more on Medicare than other regions. And so we had mentioned that I think that Minnesota or Minneapolis was like a relatively low spending region. So you can kind of see that up there. That the lighter colors mean lower spending. In particular, it looks like in 2008 they're spending around $5,000 per enrollee up in Minnesota. And then if you go down to Florida, I think they had cited like Miami as being a high spending region. And indeed here you can see that it's in the group. So Miami should be right in this red patch right over there, and it's in the group that is spending $7,000 to $11,300 per enrollee. So it seems pretty consistent with the about twice as much figure as we had mentioned before. And I guess the general pattern is to some extent, some of the urban areas seem like they're higher spending relative to some of the rural areas, but there's not even like a clear regional pattern. The South seems to be expensive, and California seems to be expensive, and then the Northeast and other regions seem to be cheaper. So again, ideally, what you would like to see is that growth in expenditures is correlated with increased survival or increased life expectancy, but you don't see that. So regions with the most growth in expenditures do not experience improved survival. So on the x-axis here is just a dollar increase in Medicare spending per enrollee, and on the y-axis is the percentage increase in 1 year survival. So ideally, what you'd like to see is a positive relationship there, and you can see that basically there's no relationship. If anything, it seems like there's a slight negative relationship. So you might think, okay, well, we talk about this like flat curve medical spending that you get a lot for the first, say, $5,000 you spend, but you don't get nearly as much for the next $5,000 that you spend. So that might be what's going on here in part, but it doesn't look like that's the only thing that's going on. So here, this is now at the state level, but what's being plotted here is the annual Medicare spending per beneficiary on the x-axis, and then basically the quality ranking. So again, quality is basically determined here by whether or not you're giving care that is consistent with the best possible evidence about what people should be, or how people should be treated, given that they have particular conditions and so forth. And so ideally, what you would presumably like to see here would be a positive relationship that places that are spending the most also are giving the most effective or the highest quality care. That's clearly not what's going on here. If anything, there seems to be a negative relationship. So Louisiana is the highest spending state on a per capita basis, and also is literally at the bottom of the quality rankings. And then you have other states like New Hampshire and Utah and Hawaii and so forth that are relatively low spending and seem to be near the top. So if anything, there seems to be like a negative relationship between spending and quality. If you look again at basically survival and costs, there doesn't seem to be much relationship at all. So this is not. Remember, the last one was quality. The last one was basically sort of trying to measure the actual inputs of care, like whether or not you're doing the right things. This one is now just whether or not you survive, given that you have like particular diseases and so forth. And that just seems to sort of have not much relationship at all with spending. So if you want to visualize how much what the cost difference is between some of these high spending and low spending regions over 25 years, it would be sort of in the range of $150,000. So you could potentially buy a pretty nice car for that much. This is again on a per enrollee basis, and this is not because this is like expected cost. So this isn't like for somebody who gets a particularly expensive disease. This is just sort of a mixture of people who are relatively healthy and relatively sick. So if there's somebody who has some particularly expensive chronic illness, then that the cost difference would be substantially higher than just $150,000 over 25 years. If we just were looking at the flat curve graph, what we potentially think is that if we're comparing, say, the U.S. versus the U.K., we're comparing two areas that are sort of at different points in the curve, but both on a range where the marginal return spending is relatively low. Or within the U.S., the analog would be, say, Minneapolis versus Los Angeles, which are low and high spending areas, respectively. So there's a reading that I've uploaded to the website, to the B-Courses site, that is I think it's like in the New Yorker. It's not, this isn't like an academic paper. It's pretty easy to read. But what it does is it focuses in on this one area in Texas called McAllen, Texas, that for whatever reason seems to have experienced tremendous cost growth over the past couple of decades. So if you actually look at it, it was back in the early 1990s. The basically per capita or the per enrollee Medicare spending level in this area was pretty similar to the U.S. average. So they're both down here around $2,000. Miami we had already flagged earlier as being a relatively high cost location, and you can see that even back in 1992 that was also true, right? So Miami was basically double the national average back then. It was $4,000. The national average is $2,000. Now, if you fast forward about 15 years to 2006, that relationship still holds. In fact, if anything, it's grown a little bit. So the national average in 2006 is just a little bit under $4,000. Miami is now breaking like $10,000 at that point. So the ratio has grown from 2 to about like 2.5 or so. But the thing that's kind of interesting is that McAllen, which used to be near the national average, has itself now taken off and is basically double the national average in just 15 years. So it's kind of an interesting like case study in the sense that it used to resemble the overall average, and now it's become one of these high cost areas. No, this is a per enrollee, right? So this is right. It's not just that like a whole bunch of retired people decided to move to McAllen or something like that, or that they had a wave of retirements. It's somehow the costs are just increasing dramatically even per enrollee. So the article kind of goes in and delves into exploring exactly what it is. So I mean, we're spending more money. This area has gone from spending at the national average to spending double the national average. Presumably, Medicare, it's a system where the hospitals provide treatments and then Medicare reimburses the hospital. So obviously, in this paperwork, you could in theory follow the chain of evidence and figure out exactly where this spending is going. So the article takes a look at that, and it turns out so what these Medicare enrollees are receiving relative to say the average Medicare enrollee in the country, it turns out they're getting 20% more abdominal ultrasounds, 30% more bone density studies. So bone density studies are basically things that you do at an older age potentially to try to diagnose whether somebody might have osteoporosis or at least be at risk of it. 60% more echocardiographs, which are basically screening for heart disease. 200% more nerve conduction studies to try to diagnose carpal tunnel syndrome, and 550% more urine flow studies to diagnose prostate cancer. So certainly one thing that is accounting for a lot of this, a lot of this increased expenditure is increases in all of these different screening panels. And the thing with screening is that it's a type of thing that that we tend to think of as being like positive, right? So it's preventative. You're trying to diagnose something before it becomes like a real problem, and ideally treat it when treatments are more effective and potentially cheaper. Often, when we think about sort of like the policy or the policy implications that revolve around screening, it's often trying to induce people to get more screening. So people, there might be screening that is in fact very effective for particular diseases, and the biggest obstacle is not that we can't do it or even that it costs too much, but just that people don't follow the guidelines. Don't go to the doctor and get their colonoscopy when they turn 50 or whatever. And so often, we think of it as something that we want to encourage, and potentially something that would even lower costs. But at some point, if you're doing incredible amounts of screening, it becomes costly in and of itself. And then furthermore, to the extent that you discover things that are kind of marginal problems and then decide to treat them, that itself is going to involve a substantial increase in costs as well. So in the article, they also talk to the actual hospital managers, and this should come as a surprise to nobody, just because everybody always, if there's any given problem, everybody always thinks that the problem is caused by a certain type of behavior, but they're also going to be sure that they themselves are not engaging in that behavior. So the hospital managers were surprised to sort of learn these facts when they were informed of them. So this is just a quote from an article. So like when the hospital managers were certain that her doctors performed surgery only when it was necessary, it had to be one of the other hospitals. So one of the hospitals that's in the area is this one called well, actually, this is the CEO of, I think it's just hospitals, but hospital chain. But anyway, this is the CEO of one of the hospitals that's in the area. And so they talked to this person. This person claims that government is the problem in healthcare. If anything, Medicare doesn't pay enough. So again, remember I said earlier that Medicare plays a very important role, not just in providing coverage to a very large group of people who would otherwise be uncovered, but it also kind of sets prices in the sense that Medicare decides how much it's going to reimburse for a specific type of diagnosis. And there's these diagnostic-related groups. And so what they generally try to do is actually provide reimbursements for specific diagnoses as opposed to for procedures, because if you provide for a procedure, then of course you're always giving an incentive to engage in more and more procedures. But anyway, so they actually have like a price list of how much they're going to reimburse for all these different conditions. And that's so hospitals basically have to play with Medicare because otherwise they would be missing out on a huge part of the market. And so Medicare will set its own prices, and that basically then sort of forms at least the basis of negotiations for all the private insurers. That's going to sort of be the benchmark that you're going to start from when you're negotiating with hospitals, how much you're going to pay for various conditions and various procedures and so forth. So the manager of this hospital thinks that if anything, Medicare is underpaying the hospitals for the procedures, and she says so. She's sort of very down on like government involvement here, even though we know that the administrative costs are pretty low compared to private health insurance. And so she says, every person in this room can easily go through the expenditures of Medicare and Medicaid and see all kinds of waste. But again, that's not what's happening here in our hospital, where we're treating all these Medicare patients here. We're providing necessary and essential healthcare. So there's sort of this disconnect between what's clearly appearing in the data, which is that these guys are, if anything, way above the national average, and yet they believe that there might be problems in other regions, but in this particular place, even though they're an outlier in the positive sense in terms of spending, they're still certain that they're only providing necessary and essential care. So in terms of thinking about, okay, so how is it that that you can get into this situation where you're spending a lot of money and not necessarily so we're trying to reconcile several sets of factors. You're spending a lot of money, you're not necessarily seeing great improvements in any sort of clinical measures, and yet whenever you talk to people, they're always saying, well, we're just doing what's best for the patient, and we're only giving care that's effective and necessary. And so one possibility is like, well, they're just completely lying to you about doing what's best for the patient and so forth. But again, I don't think that's generally the case. Like, I don't think they're literally always just thinking, well, I'm going to only worry about maximizing my revenues and I don't care at all what's happening to the patient. So there's sort of three types of healthcare treatments generically that we want to think about. So the first are just very highly cost-effective innovations, so things that have huge positive impact on clinical outcomes and also don't cost a lot of money. The second class are going to be things that are sort of potentially cost-effective but have heterogeneity in benefits. So these are going to be things that are not necessarily cheap but not all that expensive, and in some cases may be helpful, but in other cases aren't that helpful. And then the third thing are just technologies that have uncertain effectiveness. So this is where these are probably expensive and you really don't know whether or not they're particularly beneficial. So the key here is that what we want to think about is essentially the productivity of these different treatments. So we want to think about the productivity of these different treatments in terms of how often you apply them and what the marginal return to the treatments is. So this is the outcome. The treatments are X, and then the outcome is S of X. So you want to maximize S of X. So what's being plotted here is essentially just the derivative of S of X, so S prime of X. So this is like so basically that green line there is the marginal cost curve, right? So that's the cost per patient of giving this treatment X. And then the marginal benefit curve here that's on that figure is the S prime of X. So this is the benefit in terms of the outcome, and then we sort of implicitly adjusted it to dollar terms. And so what we know is that if we're just doing sort of a standard like social planner's problem, or even just sort of a standard problem from like a patient's perspective, they have to pay out of pocket. What you would want to do is sort of treat up to the point where marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. So up to the point where that S prime of X curve ends up intersecting the marginal cost curve, right? And so ideally, what you'd like to do is treat up to that point and then stop. What's often going to happen though